I think there's really only one horror film that I can say registered with me at a young age and sort of set me on the path to loving horror. And it, of course, coincides with what's become my favorite time of the year. This stretch from late September all the way through the end of the year. To me, it's the best time of the year, and nothing really personifies that more than my favorite horror film, which I think sort of, in my opinion, started the slasher character as a convention and a trope, and the Survivor Girl, as I called it, or Final Girl, as Carol Clover called it. The idea of it being fall related, the leaves turning, all that stuff. There can be really only one film for me to discuss today.
Welcome back to Scream Addicts. I'm your host, Jason Jenkins. Call me Jinx. And that was David J. Stieve talking about John Carpenter's Halloween. Mr. Stieve is a writer and producer known for Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, one of the best damned horror comedies ever made, which is now celebrating its 10th anniversary. Mr. Stieve, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Jinx. Glad to be here, and always a pleasure to talk to fellow horror fans about the stuff we love, and thanks for having me on.
Certainly. So John Carpenter's Halloween, it's a complete classic. I mean, if you're a horror fan, that's pretty much horror movie number one. Can you tell me, why is it that you zeroed in on that one for discussion? And can you maybe tell us a bit about the first time you ever saw the film?
Oh, man. First time I ever saw the film, I in reverse order, I think... Man, no one's ever asked me that before. I seem to have a memory of watching it with my older sister Christine and my cousins Julie and Lori. I want to say we were at somebody's house being babysat or something like that, and I was the youngest of the bunch. So, but man, I just remember not really understanding, I think, at that age what I was watching, but something resonated with me. Over the years, I think I've come to understand and appreciate that it's, to me, Halloween it's the purest of them all. It's certainly not scary by today's standards. It's certainly not gory by today's standards. So I think, if there's somebody out there who has not seen it or going back to, pick it up for the first time, it's strange. People, if they don't know the history of it, it's kind of a boring movie to first time viewers in 2016. You know what I mean? So, but to me, it hit at the right time, at the right age. As I've grown older, I've really come to understand the symbolism of Michael Myers as, the boogeyman. He's literally the boogeyman, the sort of faceless, driving sort of force that doesn't really need to be explained. It just is evil. And I think there's a purity in that. As a storyteller, I've always loved, and, keep it simple, stupid, right? So it's everything I think that the slasher film should be. It's pared down. It's 1978, so it's sort of inception. It's sort of infant form, and I mean that in a good way.
Now, was Halloween the first film in the Halloween franchise that you managed to catch, or are you like me in that you probably caught one of the sequels first?
No, I was watching Halloween first. I mean, it was, I was born in 71, so like I said, I'm sure I should not have been watching it, but I remember seeing it. It was on TV, of course, but so I don't know how long after that it would have been, but I definitely know that it was the first Halloween movie that I saw. The sequels, I don't have as sharp a memory of the sequels as I do of the original.
I envy you for that. My first Halloween movie was Halloween 5, watching it on television for the first time, and then I backtracked to Halloween 4, and eventually I made my way back to,
so
going
what
back
you're
to the very
saying
beginning.
So you got better and better and better the more you discovered, is what you're saying.
Kind of, yeah. And I got to admit, having watched Halloween 5 for the first time, that being my first experience with the franchise, I still have kind of a soft spot for it, if I'm being honest. I can still recognize its flaws and the flaws in, many of those entries in the franchise. But I still, I kind of love them all, except, Resurrection. But yeah, Halloween is definitely the best of the bunch. And it is funny you mentioned that it is... it isn't super scary and it isn't super gory the way a lot of those later movies, not only in the Halloween franchise, but in the sort of slasher cycle that Halloween inspired. It wasn't as gory as those later movies. And, it's more concerned with creating tension and, suspense and jolting the audience with, well-crafted scares. And
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I just got to interject there. I mean, when you watch it, Michael Myers is arguably the gentlest, kindest of the icons. This is he really doesn't do anything, terribly. He doesn't have Freddy Krueger's sort of, sense of sadism. He's not quite as brutal as Jason is. There's no trickery, there's no devices. It's just him, and he's usually, it's a knife, it's strangling, it's not. There's really nothing, and especially in the first movie, I think there's only, 4 or 5 people that actually get killed, and there's very little blood. I don't think there's much blood at all. So it's, arguably he's the most humane. Is that a word you can say for a slasher killer?
I maybe I don't think I've ever heard anyone refer to Michael Myers as humane, but I guess relatively so.
Yeah, it's pretty. If he gets you, it's pretty quick. It's pretty quick. There's not, it's pretty clean. There's not a lot of drawn out stuff. It's just sort of there he is and it's over.
If you have to be killed by a slasher, might as well be him, right?
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Can I ask, what, as a fan of the movie, what do you think drives Michael in that original film? If we can forget Halloween 2 and the revelation that Laurie is his sister, and if we forget Halloween 6 and the whole Thorn cult thing, what is Michael in this film? He kills his sister in the opening just because, and he sees a pretty young girl deliver a set of keys to his old house, and then he targets she and her friends. And there's this sort of, at times in the movie, there's kind of a playful malevolence to him. He stalks the girls. He pops out from behind corners. He dresses in sheets and sunglasses when he approaches Linda. He sets up bodies in a tombstone in bed like a house, like it's his own personal haunted fun house. And in that sense, you get the feeling that, he really is the boogeyman or the shape. It's his intent to frighten, not merely kill. And I can't think of another slasher who's quite like him in that regard, even comparing him to the later versions of, the shape in that same franchise. And it's interesting, I think.
I think, I mean, of that pantheon, I think you can sort of put, Jason is in the same kind of a era in the history of the genre and that sort of thing. But Jason was driven, purely by rage and motivation. His motivation was clear. It was just revenge, and he was fixated with the place, and he was going to kill everybody that stumbled in there. That's sort of his drive. I think you're right. I think for me, at least, the appeal for Michael Myers is, I like that it's not really explained. I mean, Donald Pleasance, has that, soliloquy in there where he says, he tried to get through to this kid and he realized that there just wasn't anything behind the eyes except evil. I like that. I like the idea that, as a storyteller, as a screenwriter, that mythic quality of Michael really resonates. It appeals to me. I think it appeals to most human beings. There's just something about a nameless, faceless killer. I am become death, right? There is no reasoning with him. There's nothing behind it. There is no cure. There isn't a moment where you can sit down and say, hey, Michael, let's get to the bottom of why you're really acting like this. He's just a manifestation of death. And I think, since it was sort of early I don't know if it was early in the genre and that's why it's been imitated so much, but I tend to subscribe to the theory that, what appeals to us horror fans or people who like to be scared by that is exactly the fact that he is faceless, that he has a mask on, which he puts the mask on as a child. He's sort of learning this part of him is coming out, right? The first thing he does is, he grabs a knife, but the second thing he does is put on a mask because he realizes, in my brain, I think he needs to, that it's that part of him that's saying, I can't be identified with a specific human, I can't be identified with a specific face or a name, or a representation. It has to be this nameless, faceless entity of evil that can appear anywhere, out of any darkness, from the caves or anywhere, So it's there's something very mythic about Michael that I think doesn't need to be explained, and that's what appeals to me about him.
I agree, but it is curious to think. I think he was scariest when he was faceless, and he was scariest when he was simply the boogeyman in Carpenter's movies. But, it's crazy to think then that of all of the Halloween movies and all of the sequels with Michael's, more specific motivations for doing what he does, going after his sister, going after family members, being part of a cult, all of that it's in this original film that we actually see Michael's face at the end. And we never do in any of the other movies, which is kind of strange considering that of all the movies, this is one that keeps him the most pure in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. I just watched it again a couple days ago before this, and I think there's a moment there where that if anything, I think that moment where she tears his mask off in the closet, um, that's to me like that. I saw that again. I viewed that for the first time as like the last flash of his humanity. Like that's almost like that echo, that ghost that it's right before he gets shot and falls off, and there's a threshold he crosses. Obviously, when he's hurt by Laurie, then he gets shot by Loomis. Sorry, spoiler alert, by the way. Um, but when he falls off, literally he sort of transcends. He falls off the balcony, right? And there's that threshold that he crosses from, for me, to being that sort of, he's just a really driven human, where he finally crosses over that into what he's going to become for the rest of the franchise. But I don't know. I think that moment where we see his face, I didn't freeze frame it or anything, but it does seem like he has sort of a pained look on his face, and I think that's the last of his humanity dying.
Yeah, absolutely. And how crazy is it to think that the first time you see the movie and you see him wearing that grotesque mask, and for all of the talk of him being the boogeyman throughout and all of the terrible things that he does, you can only imagine what's hiding behind that big white mask that he wears. And then when it's finally torn away with, looking past the fact that he's just had one of his eyes stabbed out, he's a normal looking guy. He's relatively
Right.
handsome. He's not a monster. And I think that makes him even scarier as a result. This notion that anybody could be that in a way.
Yeah, and I think that's again to me it's his transcendence there where he does have to become sort of this not faceless, he clearly has a very defined look, but the idea that his features are masked, his humanity is masked, excuse me, from that point forward, I think really lends to the creation of him. To me, again, it's mythic. So to me, he's the boogeyman, and that's a mythic creature that can be, manifest in any shape or form or any culture. So I think it just, I don't know. There, like I said at the beginning, the simplicity of the film, the simplicity of what it sets up at its core, that's what still appeals to me, and I think still holds up.
Yeah, and you mentioned boogeyman. For all of the talk of the boogeyman in the film, there isn't really anything supernatural that happens throughout the bulk of the film. Michael is a psychopath with a knife that stalks and kills people. That's relatively simple. And yet, when the film comes to a close, Loomis has just emptied a gun into him, and he simply gets up and walks away after falling off that balcony. And, we close the film with Laurie saying it was the boogeyman, as though the movie is telling us that we've been witnessing up until that point a very supernatural tale. We just didn't necessarily know it at the time. And
Yeah.
that's certainly the case with the later films, I think, which is, kind of surprising, I think. I can't think of many slasher movies or many horror movies that sort of holds that, so close to the vest throughout the entire runtime of the film, until the very end, as it were.
And another thing you maybe reminded me of is another thing I love about this movie is that it's one of the few that I can think of. Maybe you can think of a couple other ones, but even throughout the entire setup of the film, um, Loomis is pretty adamant about what Michael is. There's no question coming from him. He's like, no, this guy is evil. It's a thing. It's an it. We need to stop it. And he doesn't really get any pushback. That even the cop in Haddonfield, pretty much again watching this again, refresh this, but I love it that the cop is like, okay, I hope you're wrong, but I'm gonna stick with you, and I'll go check out this side of the house, and there's none of that trope we get in most slasher films, which is like, oh, you're being silly, or oh, you're overreacting, or oh, it's just the wind. I like that even in the it's a very small cast, obviously, but even in that community, that world they've created in Haddonfield, it's Loomis is onto him and turns out to be right. Laurie comes around. The cop never really pushes back and says, you're crazy, blah, 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 blah. And then you're right. At the end, they're sort of all proven right. No one's an idiot in this movie. And, that says a lot about horror, slasher genre, especially, through the 80s and 90s. Everybody is pretty much realizing they're dealing with something unpleasant here. They don't know what it is, but they're keeping an open mind about it. And I don't know there are a lot of other horror movies out there like that where somebody doesn't say, oh, you're being silly.
Yeah, and that's crazy to think too that wasn't even always the case with Loomis in the later entries in the franchise. Like Halloween 4, he's treated like being this crazy old man, and it's like, does no one remember the events of Halloween 1 and 2? Does no one remember that this son of a bitch was completely right, step for step, throughout this franchise?
Right.
And yet, Yeah, it does seem to be a weird sort of trope that happens where the smartest, most driven people in these movies who are completely right are treated like insane people.
And I think that's an unfortunate side effect of, where we are sort of, I don't want to throw my kind under the bus, but there's a certain expectation of screenwriters and then production executives and or development executives and people that you have to generate conflict. You have to generate conflict. If you're not without conflict, you're lost. And so of course, no one believes them, and no one believes the person who really has the truth, and no one else sees the killer but the victim. And I think we've sort of painted ourselves into a corner. As viewers and storytellers and screenwriters and development people, as I said, where, we're sort of slaves to this conflict thing. And I think that's where a lot of this comes, because what's better conflict than having somebody pounding their fists on the window saying, no, turn around, and nobody believes them. So, it's unfortunate, but I get that, again, in Halloween, the original isn't really very suspenseful. It's really not. There's only a handful of moments where there's any shocks or you kind of see what's coming. You kind of see Michael coming the whole time. And he's seen a lot during the daytime. He's seen a lot during the daylight hours, which is also unique.
Driving around in a Smiths Grove sanitarium car, no less. I mean, he's in plain sight in the entire film until it turns night, at which point he sort of recedes into the shadows. But
standing on the sidewalk, he's standing in the between the sheets of the clothesline. He's out there. He confronts Bobby or whatever, the little kid. This is not a guy who's waiting till midnight.
We're talking about Sam Loomis here. I mean, he's got to be one of the greatest heroes, I think, in all of horror films. And he's what you referred to as an Ahab in Behind the Mask with your Doc Halloran character played by Robert Englund. And, rather than being like a fanatic driven by hate, as with Melville's Captain Ahab, both Loomis and Halloran seem to be driven by this sort of need to do good and protect others. And I was wondering if Loomis would you say he was your sole inspiration for Doc Halloran, or just one of many, would you say?
It's overwhelmingly Loomis. I mean, he's the king, but I think again, I keep reverting back to this sort of mythic storytelling. That's what drives a lot of my writing, is that Loomis himself is an archetype. There is always the Obi-Wan character. There is always the wise old sage in the woods who has the answer. It's oh my God, what's from the Jaws, Shaw's character in Jaws.
Quint.
Yeah, Quint. I mean, Quint was another, sort of inspiration there, where you have somebody who knows what's up. There's always that, but I mean, the archetype was there, is what I'm saying. And Loomis was just sort of the clearest example of that archetype. And to me, once I started thinking about, Behind the Mask and what went into that character construction and, what and who Leslie Vernon was, and I started to sort of deconstruct that genre lovingly, it was, pretty clear that we needed a Donald Pleasance type character. So, overwhelmingly Loomis, but Loomis himself was, already sort of ingrained in my memory, sort of in more of a mythic sense.
Yeah, and how great is Donald Pleasance in that role? I'm a huge Christopher Lee fan, and as much as I love him, and I can't really imagine anybody else playing Loomis but Donald Pleasance. And apparently Christopher Lee was up for the role and turned it down, but Pleasance is incredible playing this guy who is he's a good man, sure, and he's driven, but you can tell even in that first movie he's more than a little unhinged at times.
Yeah, and I think it's whether it was an acting choice or whether it was just a directing choice, or I don't know what it was, but I love that he just barely starts to chew the scenery a little bit when he's talking about him. But he even, it's not even, Donald Pleasance just sort of reined it in just on the edge of it almost becoming comic, like when he's talking about him, like to pull off a conversation about a 6-year-old being evil could have been handled pretty poorly. It could have been pretty campy. And, but he towed that line the whole time where it was just far enough that he didn't go into parody, and I love that about the performance.
But it only built and built and built, I think, with the franchise. He's a little crazier in 2. He's even, more unhinged in Part 4. And then in Part 5, you have him dangling poor Jamie Lloyd in front of Michael and, screaming Michael's name while beating him with a wooden plank. It just goes into,
Yeah.
really crazy territory. And yet, to be fair to Pleasance, he always sells those moments. But but looking back at that original movie, Loomis has sort of his own journey in the film, which is completely separate from Laurie Strode in the film, and that's pretty much true of Loomis throughout the entire franchise. I mean, in Halloween 2, he's paired up with Sheriff Brackett and Deputy Hunt. And then, jumping ahead to Halloween 4, he spends most of the movie traveling to Haddonfield and then partnering with the new sheriff there, Sheriff Meeker. And, I'm just wondering, as a writer, do you think that, an Ahab is at his most effective when he's separated from the hero of the movie, or the heroine in this case? And if so, why is that, do you think?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I think just by definition, part of the Ahab is, that Ahab monster relationship it is sort of tormented. It is sort of, it's tragic in a way. It's almost, it's like a dark, sort of twisted love story in a way. They're sort of better apart, but they both desperately need each other. And I think it's weird. The Ahab character needs his monster much more than vice versa. But, sort of the joke that we explore in Behind the Mask is that, almost part of an Ahab's job, whether they like it or not, is marketing, is promotion. The Ahab's presence, they're the ones out there touting, the existence of the whale or the monster. They're the ones trying to tell everybody, no, 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 you need to be aware of this. So it's sort of this reverse weird promotional thing that Ahabs do for their monster. But when they come together, obviously it's tough. It's got to resolve itself one way or another. So I mean, the relationship obviously they can't exist together for long because they'll either destroy each other or one of them will win or some. I mean, they can't carry on to perpetuity unless they're separated. So I don't know. I guess it's sort of maybe a sun and planet type of relationship where they sort of revolve around one another and they do have an effect on each other. But if they're not locked in motion, it means sort of the end for one or both of them.
Very true. And I so far as the flip side to to the Ahab coin, as it were, or maybe not the flip side necessarily, but we do have the other piece of the puzzle. We have the boogeyman, we have the Ahab, and then we have the final girl or survivor girl, as in Behind the Mask, and here it's Laurie Strode. And, I just spoke to Patrick Reynolds a couple of episodes ago, and he chose the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to talk about. And, I mentioned to him that Sally Hardesty is pretty much, I think, my favorite final girl. But, Laurie is amazing, too. And in many ways, Laurie is sort of much more of what we expect from final girls of that era. She's very much the girl next door type, which, Sally Hardesty wasn't necessarily. But how do you feel about Laurie Strode overall as a final girl and, in that sort of pantheon, as it were?
I can answer that by one of the sort of few times I get to name drop I was at a premiere screening or it was a horror movie festival screening or something like that where I got to meet Jamie Lee Curtis. And that's one of the only times I felt, like the palms sweating and felt the heart pounding a little bit. And, it couldn't have been a less interesting interaction. And I was introduced to her and I said hello, and somebody, I remember somebody mentioning that I'd written Behind the Mask, and again, she was absolutely wonderful and polite, but it was just sort of, you could tell that she's had that conversation 1,000 times, and she hadn't seen the movie, unfortunately, but it was just in that 10-second interaction, I know that just how nervous I felt. It was entirely because I couldn't. That was one of the times in my life I couldn't really separate the actress from the character that I first saw her in. To me, I was like, I was rational enough to know I'm meeting Jamie Lee Curtis, but I'm like, oh my God, this is Laurie Strode. This is crazy. And so, I mean, that's obviously to me, she's the first. I mean, I agree. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, being a close second. Sidney Prescott, I guess, in a way, is another survivor girl or a final girl that influenced me while I was writing Behind the Mask, but it's not really even close. I mean, it's Jamie Lee is the queen, and I think, I don't know, it's interesting. I read recently that John Carpenter was saying that he'd never ever set out to create an expectation or sort of this genre staple that Survivor or Final Girls were the pure chaste ones who didn't do drugs and didn't have sex. That was not his intention. In fact, he explained it as I read it that um, Laurie Strode sort of survives because she's paying attention, and all the other characters, they're high or they're drunk or they're having sex, so their guard is down and they're just sort of not paying attention, and that's how the killers can kind of get the drop on them. And that Laurie was just she was sober, she was taking care of some kids, she was used to being alone, so she was just sort of more hyper aware of her surroundings. It was never intended to be a moral a commentary. And so that sort of evolved out of that, and it got latched onto by a lot of other, subsequent films. But Laurie's definitely set, whether it was intentional or not, Laurie Strode set the bar, I think, in my opinion, for what it means to be a final girl. She's sort of righteous. She's doing the right thing. She's putting the needs of other people first. She's not engaging in, narcissistic stuff. And I think that, to me, she's what started it all.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I mean, that, there is that notion, people talking about horror movies, especially the horror movies of the 80s, as having, the final girls having to be sort of virginal good girls, quote unquote, who don't do drugs or anything of that sort, in order to be able to survive. And, I think that is probably true of some of the movies of that era. It's not true of Halloween. Early on, Laurie smokes a joint with Annie. And she's pining over Ben Tramer, and there is that line that Annie has, so you do think about things like that or whatever. I think it is strange that Halloween is lumped into that sort of group of movies that are meant to be, sort of commentaries on morality in a way. And I'm glad you pointed out that that's not really true of that movie, even if it is one of the first of the slasher cycle.
You're right. It's not. I mean, I think it gets lumped in retroactively from people who are, they're just sort of looking to prove their argument, or academically. I think it just sort of it's, I mean, Carol Clover's work, right, is sort of the seminal work about the final girl, and I get it, but even if I'm not mistaken, even she sort of said, look, it's really not about, being chaste and pure and virginal. It's sort of about, feminist empowerment, and so it's a woman that is able to sort of stand up to this. Those arguments go back and forth, but I don't know where the idea of the virgin survives and the girl who doesn't do drugs survives, but I don't know. I think it's a detriment to the genre moving forward. I think it's a detriment to, oh man, I don't know if I want to step on this, but it's silly from a women's rights perspective. I mean, it's really a double standard to say, only the purest survive. Well, pure by whose standards? And it doesn't really hold up. It doesn't hold up in Scream. It doesn't hold up some of the other horror. I don't know. I don't think it holds up in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. She's certainly not an innocent. So I don't know. You're right. I mean, the argument is always there, but the evidence doesn't seem to support it.
Yeah, I agree. And, when it comes to slasher movies, I mean, there's a sort of charge that a lot of horror movies of the 80s and 90s, arguably all the way up until today, but, are that some are sort of inherently misogynistic in a way because the violence is always targeted on, young women. And yet it is always women who are sort of the ones with the upper hand at the end of the film and who are ultimately the heroes of the movie. So how do you feel about the subgenre as a whole? Do you think there is a sort of misogyny there, or do you think that's sort of a misplaced notion?
I think there is. I mean, I think that it's the whole subgenre, all of it. It's been so dissected. I mean, everybody's trying to deconstruct and reconstruct, and the meta, awareness aspect, and the films within films, and the reflection of people citing movies in a movie, and it's I don't know. It's been dissected and analyzed to death. But I think I don't know. I mean. Oh, wow, I don't know. Isn't any time you put a female in jeopardy, it's sort of inherently misogynistic, I guess. But it's also a reflection of it's still a male-dominated industry. Unfortunately, it's still driven by I don't even know if I want to say that it's the film industry. I mean, as storytellers, again, it's always the damsel in distress. The hero is typically a male. I mean, it's so ingrained in our human that human gene for how we listen and understand stories that, I don't know how you disarm that or how you diffuse it. Certainly, I feel like stories are getting better, and we're becoming more aware of that, and those sort of gender issues are obviously in the forefront. I think hopefully it's going to translate to our entertainment, but it takes a long time to turn a battleship, and this is thousands and thousands of years of storytelling.
Yeah, and we were talking about the final girl trope, as it were, and how silly it is, that notion. I think that she has to be like the good girl type, and I think even so far as Jamie Lee Curtis is concerned, they were trying to turn that notion on its head with Halloween H2O, the 20th anniversary movie, by having Laurie be an alcoholic and showing her in a relationship, and just trying to run as far away from you know who that character was in the first film as they could. But she's so great in that franchise too. She's a perfect choice for Laurie, not only because she's very good in the role, she's a very good actress, but it is kind of cool to be able to connect Halloween to its forebear Psycho by virtue of the fact that Jamie Lee Curtis was Janet Leigh's daughter, the star of Psycho, and it was so great. Just as a fan, just as a horror nerd, to see Janet Leigh pop up in Halloween H2O, albeit briefly, driving even the very same car from Psycho.
Right. I just I just realized I'm completely busting myself because I didn't really do anything to help defeat the misogyny or the idea of the survivor girl being pure and chaste, in Behind the Mask either. So full disclosure, I just realized I need to turn that, that reflection back on myself and acknowledge that I was guilty of exactly the same thing.
Well, you did subvert it a bit with the who we expected to be the survivor girl in Behind the Mask, and there is that great reveal too. I think in when everybody steps into the bedroom, it's one of my favorite moments in the film. But
Right.
but yeah, ultimately Taylor is. I mean, she does sort of fall into that by the end, doesn't she? But it's still a great character, and I think that the movie's being honest about looking at those movies and sort of having been maybe lampooning that genre a bit. But as a fan, I appreciated that.
Well, okay. Thank you for letting me off the hook there. I appreciate that. So, I guess in the future I'm gonna have to maybe write maybe let's get a female slasher killer and see if we can turn the tables 180 degrees, right?
Would your slasher still be called Leslie?
You know what? That's something we talked about that was sort of an intentional. The names of the characters in Behind the Mask are all kind of. Well, Taylor and Leslie obviously are both very androgynous. So I was toying with a little bit of not having, being like, Tom and Susie. So I don't know. I don't know if I really had a deeper motivation than that, but I do remember thinking, let's go with something that's a little, I didn't want it to be such a clear characterization just in the name. I wanted it to be a little cloudy.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned you had talked about that. Is there still I have to ask, as a fan of Behind the Mask, I adore that movie, but is there a possibility still of a follow-up coming down the road at some point?
Yes, the possibility is there. Like you and I had mentioned, we were talking before this, that I'm always very wary of getting people's hopes up. So I feel like we've sort of pulled the rug out from everybody a couple too many times in the past 10 years or so. But the desire is there. The story is certainly there. The Leslie Vernon universe, hasn't receded. It's Leslie's been up to plenty of stuff. Taylor's been up to plenty of stuff. And from a filmmaking standpoint, um, obviously spent a lot of time talking with Scott Glosserman, the producer director on the first one, and I'm still very close with Nathan. Um, it's never far from our minds, and the characters are certainly living, very rich, full lives. Unfortunately, we just haven't been able to put it together and, to get that whole thing back together on the business side, just to make the movie work. It's hard. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you and your fans don't know, but when you create an independent film, to get everybody together, it's sort of a minor miracle that the people to all come together and they're all available and the story's there and the script is there and the money's there and the actors are there and the locations are there and the camera works and all that stuff happens. It's pretty amazing. But even when you're shooting a first film, for lack of a better way to say it, you don't always get the first people you want. You don't always get the first setting you want. Scenes don't always turn out the way you want them to. just based on location and what's available. So you kind of you start out with one intention, and maybe you don't get actor number one for that role. Maybe you get actor number three. Um, Maybe you don't get the location you wanted, but you get this location, so you tweak it a little bit. Um, my point in saying all that is, we got very lucky that everything came together and we got exactly the right people we needed. And now you can't imagine those roles and those characters, without those actors in those roles. You can't imagine, we'd have to go back and find this similar place. So what I'm saying is to do it once is it's sort of a miracle what comes together. To try to do a sequel, you don't have the luxury of saying, well, we didn't get him, but we're going to get her. You know what I mean? You have to get everybody that you had the first time back together. There's no wiggle room there in a sequel. And it's hard. It's really hard. It's like trying to we joke and say it's like trying to land a jumbo jet on a balance beam. So the story's there, the desire's there, the people are there and ready. It's just a matter of the business end of it not ever coming together yet.
I'm so glad you mentioned that too. As a fan of the movie, I know personally, like I am willing to wait so long as everyone makes it back. I can't imagine some of those roles being recast. I can't imagine anybody else as Leslie Vernon, for example, or Taylor for that matter.
Absolutely not. You couldn't do it without Nathan at all. And Taylor, and the thing, it gets lost a lot, but I love it when I get to do these where I get to sort of point this out. So I hope it gets out there further. But Behind the Mask, it's a slasher. It's a very loving slasher satire, but really it's a love story. This is really, really about Taylor and Leslie, and these are two people that have come together in the worst possible way. This horrible Romeo and Juliet type of a thing. And that's really the core of it. So, with all the stories moving forward, it's always about how in the world do I get Taylor and Leslie back in the same room? How in the world do I get them interacting with each other in a way, given how the movie ended? And that's always been the challenge. But if you don't have Nathan and you don't have Angela in there, you've already set yourself back so far, in my opinion. And Scotty feels the same way. And Nathan and Angela are both they're both game for it, but there's no way to do it without them.
Now, I don't want to push you on it too much. But can I ask, you mentioned that the characters are still living, sort of rich, full lives. And I was wondering, when the film happens, will it ultimately account for the years that have passed? Or will it be, like a lot of slasher films in that, it starts like the next moment after, or a day after, a week after, something like that? Or will there have been some time that has passed in between the films, do you think?
There will have been some time that's passed. It's just not going to be the next minute like Halloween 2. Scotty and I talked about that, and for various reasons that all come together very nicely. The narrative, the story, the mythology, all of it needs to, even basically just based on what Leslie says during the first movie, how complicated it is. There has to be time that passes before we can create a universe in which it makes any sense that these characters are going to have to be forced to interact again.
Very cool. I for one can't wait to see it. I think it'll be brilliant. Can I ask one last thing, and I'll leave Behind the Mask alone, I promise. Will it still be not found footage, but sort of the faux documentary style that the bulk of the previous film was, or will it be more of the traditional slasher film that the final third of the first film was?
That's a great question, and that's something that that's ultimately it's not entirely my call. I mean, I have to defer to Scott has a very clear vision, and he took the script that I had for the first one and managed to bring it to life in a way that exceeded my expectations. We've talked a lot about the sequel. It is written, and part of it was, how do I answer this without him coming after me and beating me about the head and neck? It took us a long time to figure out a way to get Taylor and Leslie back in the same room. And then the question, as you just mentioned, was, well, how in the world would this happen with a camera over their shoulders? And the best answer I can give you is that there's a development, there's an arc that Leslie is going through and what he's trying to do that's going to naturally push him, unfortunately, farther and farther from the jovial, engaging guy who can laugh and joke on a documentary camera to, in the scope of it, ultimately what he's trying to do. If he's going to become a Jason or a Michael, he's clearly not going to be able to be accessible in that way. So where are we in his evolution? And where is Taylor? How far is she trailing? And where is she in that? And her, they're traveling parallel tracks, of course. And all I can say is we found a way to bridge that gap between the aw shucks, mockumentary style of what everybody loves about Leslie, Leslie Mancuso, when he's not in character as the boy. We found a way to get some of that back, but at the same time realizing that, these are two people that went through a pretty horrible ordeal, and Taylor's pretty pissed, and so there's a way. We found a way, but I can't really say any more than that.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks so much for saying that. I appreciate it. So, and I got to imagine I'm not alone in that. I'm dying to see the follow up to the film. So I can't wait.
We're dying to get it out there. So, and I can say it's not lost on Scotty or myself or anybody involved in the first one that it's fans, it's the fan sites and the horror community in general, especially the horror community that supports independent horror. We would be nowhere without you guys. I absolutely 100% mean that. There's the theatrical release was a disaster. We're all grown-ups. We're fully willing to admit that. And the film, by all rights, should have been dead and gone, 2 months after it was out. But it's not. And it's just growing, and it's growing and growing. And it's completely because of the underground independent horror film community that has absolutely championed Leslie Vernon and embraced him and keeps him out there and keeps him in the conversation. And he shows up in articles and lists, and it's overwhelming the amount of support. It's unbelievably. I can't even express my gratitude for the fact that you guys, the horror community, has kept Leslie Vernon behind the mask, even in the conversation that people are still 10 years later saying, when is the sequel going to happen? We want to tell it. We want to give you more of Leslie Vernon. And we wouldn't have a chance to even be having this conversation without you guys.
Very cool. Well, thanks again for having made the first movie in the first place. It felt like when it came out, it was sort of a gift to fans of the genre and, to movies like Halloween, or for fans of movies like Halloween, rather. So, yeah, cool. I can't wait. So, okay, back to Halloween just for a second. I gotta ask, we've been talking about the writing and talking about the story, but can we just chat for a second about the craft of the film and how incredibly well made it is?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not great on the production side of things. I'll be the first one to tell you. I don't know the first thing about pointing a camera, but watching it, it's there's really no wasted space in there. It's a slow movie. There's not a lot happening. So by today's standards, again, I think people coming to it for the first time would be like, this is, they'd want to hit the fast forward button. But to me, I don't know. It's just, it works, and it's a pretty fast. It was like an hour and a half, 2 hours. I think it's just under 2 hours. And I think it's, even though it's bordering on monotonous at times, the monotony works. And I think I don't know. I have a lot more patience, I think, viewing films like that. But to me, there's no wasted space in that movie.
Yeah, agreed. And, it's so beautiful, too. Like, Dean Cundey's photography in the film was gorgeous, and Carpenter's music is just superb. I mean, do you think there's a more iconic piece of music in all of horror than that main Halloween theme?
Absolutely not. I mean, I don't think there's a more iconic piece of music other than maybe Jaws in all of cinema.
Yeah, true. Very true, Jaws. Certainly those two. I mean, they're so.
Or maybe 2001. I don't know, but that wasn't original. You know what I mean? So I don't know, man. I'd be hard pressed if somebody to come up with a piece of music that's more immediately attached to a film and a mood.
Yeah, it's funny though, mentioning the music. I mean, John Carpenter, not only did he co-write the film, he directed it, he did the music, and ultimately, it's Carpenter's name that goes above the title. It's not merely a film by John Carpenter. I mean, it's John Carpenter's Halloween. And, one of the things I wanted to ask you, as a writer, how do you feel about that sort of possessory credit, not only in this movie, but like in filmmaking in general?
I think, I don't know. I take it at face value. I think um, given the quality of what the person's putting out there. I guess I feel like it's to put your name above the line on something, or a film by or such and such as parentheses s, or apostrophe s. I think it can be very tricky if it's just a narcissistic sort of a vanity thing. But it's also, you're right, as a storyteller or creator, to say, look, this is mine. And I mean, I'm very sensitive to, in the film industry in particular, the content creator, the writer, really somehow is sort of a pushed to the bottom of the stack. It's not the same way it is in television. Showrunners are the king. Obviously, Broadway playwrights are the king. You see that a lot more. Neil Simon's this or blah blah blah. It's a lot more common, I think, in even in literature. I think the name of the author becomes its own thing. Dean Koontz or Stephen King or et cetera, et cetera. Only in film is the writer, the content creator pushed to the bottom of the barrel, and it's infuriating. But it's just somehow that's the way the film industry in particular has evolved. So in that sense, if somebody wants to put their name above the title, good for them. The writer in me says, absolutely, brother, it's fight the power, right? But I think if it becomes, how do I say this right? If it's a stinking pile of crap, or they maybe a person doesn't have their they don't have the resume to back it up, and that they keep doing it, I think you can very easily cross over into narcissism. So I feel like initially, if you're going to do that, great, but you better have the product to back it up. Otherwise, you're sort of setting that cause back. If you're just putting your name up there because you're paying the bills and you're putting out a piece of junk, you're not helping yourself or that fight that I was just talking about. So it's kind of, I don't know if that's an answer, but it's kind of got to be a case by case. If you're going to put your name in front of a movie, you better have a pretty good product after your name.
Having revisited this movie just recently to prepare for this conversation, and I mean, it's getting to be fall. I was planning on watching all of these movies a few times again anyway, the entire franchise. But, I was struck by a couple of moments throughout. It's such a well-crafted movie, and yet there are moments that feel a little... I don't want to knock the movie because I adore the movie, but in the interest of being completely honest, I'll say, there are moments that are kind of dodgy in it. That great opening sequence. There's that amazing point of view shot and the that sort of marvelous Steadicam work. But it's also kind of unintentionally hilarious when you realize, I mean, it's one unbroken take, so you realize that poor Judith and her boyfriend have had sex for all of 90 seconds at the beginning of the movie. Did anybody think about that on set? Was it meant to be kind of a gag in a way? And then we have we have that strange moment with Michael and his parents, the big reveal when he steps out and the mask is pulled off and he's standing there with a knife and the camera cranes up super high. And, I always just kind of bought that moment, when I was a kid watching the movie. But watching it again as an adult, it's such a strange choice to have them discover their son holding a bloody knife.
Right, and there's that. Nobody reacts, and they all open so nicely to the camera and stand there and hold their poses. Yeah,
and it's such a weird moment. But I mean, the movie isn't flawless, and yet what it gets right, it gets so right that as a viewer and a fan, I'm willing to sort of look past some of those flaws, and even kind of find them charming in a way. But I have to admit, I don't hate me for this. Not only you, but listeners out there, please. Don't come out with daggers for this, but that moment is sort of paid homage to in the Rob Zombie remake, and arguably he kind of did that one moment better, where it seems like all of time stands still around Michael, as he looks at the camera, which I thought was kind of interesting. But that is one thing I wanted to ask you about. I mean, we talked about the sequels a little bit. As a fan of the first movie, how do you feel about the Zombie remake and its sequel?
Well, before I will answer that, but I do want to say, I mean, just to your point, I would remind you to, keep in mind that, it was 1978. It was, an independent filmmaker. And so that transition from, I think film went through a transition from, theatrical stage plays to, being performances to trying to capture on film. So there still was a little bit of that, I think, ingrained in John Carpenter probably. There still was a little bit of that, look, we this is a fantastic world we're creating. So they wasn't quite the same homage to reality that that Rob Zombie is sort of adhering to. Um, but I also, to me, it's always a conversation I have about Blade Runner. Not to get totally off track, but
No,
I'm
please.
always touting Blade Runner as to me, I think it's the greatest sci-fi film of all time. And people who haven't seen it before, like my girlfriend, I made her watch it for the first time, and there's always this reaction of, well, what's the big deal? I've seen this a million times before. And so people lose perspective on, yeah, but this was case number one. So I think that, in retrospect, there's a little bit of that maybe I think, Halloween is unfortunately subjected to, which is it still was the first to do that, to have a perspective of a killer going up the stairs and then pulling back out and transitioning out, and it's a little kid. Like that was sort of the first time anybody had ever done that. So I'm willing to forgive its hokiness and its bumps along the way again because to me it's 1978. But that's just me. But to answer your question, I'm fine with the remakes. I've come a long way on Rob Zombie. I wasn't a big fan of his work early on. I'm not a big gore guy. I don't think. I think to me there's a difference between being scared and being visibly upset. There's a difference between being scared and being grossed out. So gore and blood and guts and people holding their own limbs and things falling off of people's bodies and guts spilling out, like that doesn't scare me later when I'm driving home in the car by myself down a country road. You know, Michael Myers popping up in the back seat, that scares me when I'm driving home in a car by myself on a country road. And the reason I say that is because I felt early on that Rob Zombie was just going for the gore and the visual startles and the scares. I didn't really get any of the sort of terror. Um, and I was wrong. I mean, I've come around on Rob Zombie's work. I think, he obviously loves the genre and what he's doing is coming from a place of love, and I respect that. And, the sequels and the remakes and the everything that's plaguing it, I get it. We want to try to recapture those feelings we had when he was little or when I was little. I mean, we want to try to recreate what, the feelings we had we liked. So I don't know. I don't object to the sequels and the remakes and the reloads and relaunches or whatever. I just, because I understand it's coming from a place of love, unless it's just an overt cash grab from a studio. But I don't know. To me, I'd rather just go back and rewatch the original, but that's just me.
Fair enough. Yeah, and it does have sort of I mean, in a way, the film ends in such a way that it feels like it does set up a sequel, but in a way, not. I mean, there is that great final sequence that closes the film, showing those static shots of the various locations that Michael had been during, during his stay in Haddonfield, as though, well, what? I mean, it's showing all the places that he had marked almost, maybe, that, are we to take it as viewers to mean that these are the places in this town would never be the same in a way, or is it meant to be simpler, do you think? I mean, is it just merely all the places that he might be hiding or might be hanging out just around the corner ready to strike again? But there is that sound of his labored breathing over many of those final shots, almost as though he's existing in all of those places at once.
Yeah, I think to me, I take it to mean, he's clearly he's not dead. I think there are some people that say, that when his body vanishes, that he's transcended or, crossed over to the supernatural world. I don't really buy that. I think he just got up and walked away. But I don't know. I think when the static shots to me, I don't know. I guess to me it's sort of a reminder of, look, this is the inception of this boogeyman. This is, the shape, right? It's sort of a all of the ground, all of the fertile soil is still there, and it's almost there's nothing complicated about it. I mean, this is a guy who, he returned to his roots, and that's all he's known, and he's sort of finding different ways to interact with the world, as it is today. But he's going back through, the same places, he has a very limited range, I guess. So I don't know. To me, I think it's you look at the ground in the fall and the winter, and it's everything's dead and there's nothing growing there, but in the spring stuff's going to come up. So I don't know if there's an analogy to be made there, but I feel like you're just sort of, you're looking at the shape may be gone for now, but whatever brought him into Inception in the first place, that fertile soil is still there.
Now that we've talked about Halloween, and given that you've written a slasher classic in its own right, can I ask, if given the opportunity, where might you take the Halloween franchise? Or, as a fan, where might you like to see it go?
Oh man, wow. That just made me almost nervous with the excitement of that. But I mean, that would be such a massive responsibility. It actually made me nervous. To me, I can tell you for sure it would Michael would not he wouldn't be a superhero like it's not a superhero. He wouldn't be a sort of superhuman figure like Jason is. Like to me, Michael is, like I said, just he's a shape, he's an entity that exists in his own right, and I think that there's an evil in that, and there's something scary about that when it doesn't need to be really explained or motivated. Um, I don't know. It's interesting because there's so many. Would Laurie Strode still be alive? How do I bring her back? To me, again, obviously, I said before, I'm a big fan of the inherent love stories in all these, and I think for whatever reason, Laurie and Michael are connected, so that would have to be part of it for me. Um, I guess I'd have to look for some sort of where are they in their relationship? Where how are each of them advancing the mythology of what it means to be to be a boogeyman and to be a victim, or the person that's sort of like I said, like traveling in those sort of concentric circles. Um, I don't know, how would I guess I'd have to find some sort of hybrid. It would probably be an alternate reality, different future type of thing that's much more in line with one and two. Um, I don't know if I couldn't have Michael and Laurie interacting and have somehow Loomis's presence or his spirit or something of him in that. I think those are the three pieces that I would have to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is as much as I love Halloween H2O, you know, and I think it would have been actually a nice closer to that franchise before they, went one further with Halloween Resurrection, which is a movie I despise on several different levels. But you can feel Loomis missing. Like, you need him in that film as much as you need. I mean, Halloween 4 and 5 have Jamie Lloyd, and she more or less takes the place of Laurie Strode in those films. But then you get to the sixth one, and she's sort of unceremoniously killed, and you don't really have anyone taking your place. I mean, the movie has its heroes, and Loomis is still there. But you're right. I think you need that sort of you need that trinity in Halloween. I think you need the boogeyman, you need the Ahab, and you need the survivor girl, I think. And
and I guess I don't know that I feel like I would need to bring Loomis back, resurrect him, or if he wasn't really dead or something. There's probably other ways that his influence could be there, but I don't know. Now that I think about it more, if it was turned over to me and I was lucky enough to do that, I think I don't think there's anything wrong either with having a little closure on a story on characters like this. I mean, if there's some sort of actual finality that maybe Michael can get whatever it is he's after, or there's some closure with Laurie finally sort of ending him once and for all, and there's a sacrifice there, or Loomis's memory or spirit, or something is critical to that. Like, that to me, I guess, would be the appeal of a franchise like this. It would be nice to finish the tale, and then everybody obviously would shudder at that idea in Hollywood, because of course you can't leave any money on the table. But I don't know, if it was up to me, I think I would find a way to end the Laurie Michael love story once and for all.
I'm glad you said that, because, as a fan of horror movies, that is one thing that a lot of big franchises never have. They never have an ending. I catch a lot of hell for, admitting my love for this film, but, Mick Garris's Psycho 4 has a great ending for a, if you want to call Norman Bates a slasher character. And that's something that's not really given to many of the icons often. There isn't closure. There isn't a natural end to those tales. And I think as a result, they're always kind of, that is a weakness, I think, of the storytelling in some of those franchises. And I wish it were the case that a lot of them would build toward an ending, but that's just me.
I agree. I agree. I mean, every story needs its ending. It's just, that's how we're wired as human beings. And it's been a hell of a run, but I mean, it's if you don't deliver the ending, you haven't really delivered on the promise of telling a story. I mean, that's how we absorb, that's how we incorporate things into our life and then move on.
I agree. All right, sir. I think that's just about our time. Thank you so much for being on the show and for choosing this movie to talk about. It's one of my favorite horror movies. It's one of my favorite movies, period. And I'm glad to have been able to talk about it with you.
It's been a pleasure, man, and I thank you again for having me on. And happy Halloween season to everyone out there. This is the best time of the year.
Agreed. And listeners, thanks so much for checking this episode out. Please be sure to like, subscribe, share, use the comment section below. Maybe leave us an iTunes review and yell at us on Facebook or Twitter. That's at Screamatics, and I am at Jinx 1981. That's JINX 1981. Be sure to use the Amazon links below to purchase Behind the Mask or the Halloween films. Remember, any Amazon purchase you make through our site will help ensure that there will be a new episode next week. And we still have that deal for you through Audible. Make certain to sign up for a free 30-day trial, and you'll get 2 free books. So thanks so much for listening, folks, and have a great weekend.